Welcome back to the second James W. Richard lecture on the development of religious giving in the early Christian church by Professor Peter Brown. It's actually wonderful to see so many of you returning to what are clearly both fascinating and beautifully delivered lectures by Professor Brown. And I'd like to invite Professor Bruce Halsinger from English Department, who will introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Peter Brown. Bruce.
Thank you, Mark. Since my colleagues gave such marvelous general introductions yesterday to the Page, Barber, and Richards lectures, as well as to Peter Brown's career and work, I'll have the luxury of relative brevity. And the other good news is that at least a third of my words will be the words of Peter Brown himself, beginning with these. I have tried in this book to convey something of the course and quality of Augustine's life. Not only did Augustine live in an age of rapid and dramatic change, he himself was constantly changing. The historian of the declining Roman Empire can trace through his life the movements that would lead Augustine the schoolboy, weeping over the old story of Dido and Aeneas in a secure province, to end his life as the Catholic bishop of a North African port that was blockaded by the war bands of a tribe, which had ultimately come from southern Sweden. He can also seize some of the more elusive changes in the man himself. He will be constantly reminded, often by a stray detail, by nothing more perhaps than by a turn of phrase used in addressing a friend, of the long inner journeys of Augustine. Most difficult of all and most rewarding, the historian can attempt to seize that crucial area where external and internal changes touch each other. Augustine will have to meet the challenge of new environments. His style of life will be unconsciously transformed by long routines, and outside circumstances in their turn will take on a different meaning at different times by being subtly charged with his personal preoccupations. By writing, by acting, by influencing an ever-increasing body of men, he will help to precipitate changes in the world around him that were no less headlong than his own inner transformations. I shall be more than satisfied if I have given some impression of the subtle overlapping of these differing levels of change, and if, in so doing, I have encouraged others to believe that it is possible to glimpse a figure in so distant a past in this way. Thus begins Augustine of Hippo, a book published in 1967, 45 years ago, that many would still consider one of the greatest biographies ever written. The paragraph I've just read served as my own introduction to Peter Brown, which came in the wake of some silly, uninformed comment I'd made in a seminar about the monolithic ideology of the Christian church. My teacher at the time, and subsequently my dissertation director, Carolyn Bynum, one of Peter Brown's greatest fans, looked at me with a wry smile. "I think you need to read some Peter Brown," she said. And I did, and those opening sentences of Augustine of Hippo still resound in me as a model for the appreciation of the enduring complexity of the past. As a scholar of literature, drama, novelistic prose, lyric poetry, I've never been able to read Peter Brown's work without close reading it, without thinking carefully about the work it does in its diction, its syntax, its rhetorical elegance, as it makes the historical and theological arguments articulated in the many influential books his distinguished career has given us. Let's think about that final sentence for a moment. The writer will be satisfied in the results of his labor if he's given an impression of subtlety that encourages belief in the possibility of a glimpse of a distant past. The packing together of a string of subordinate and relative clauses, those intertwined prepositional phrases, those promising infinitives, to believe, to glimpse, it's a sentence that violates every rule of Strunk and White. Yet in these generous feints and half-promises lie the power of Peter Brown's prose, that someone who knows and tells so much would hope for what sounds like so little from his readers. It all comes down in the end to a small glimpse of something new. How to describe this capacity to capture the simultaneously capacious and intricate lineaments of a bygone epoch? Perhaps Peter Brown is to the pre-modern world what Google Earth is to our own. Late antiquity is his globe, and when he zooms in with street view, we can see the surprisingly sharp outline of a Coptic papyrus, or the hazy possibilities of a North African dream. Zoom out again, and we see the zigzagging networks of trade, itinerant evangelism, and literary transmission that create the vast circuits of social and religious change traced in his writing. Powering Peter Brown's server are the innumerable languages, archives, and disciplines he's mastered over many years, unified by some mysterious algorithm that allows it to synthesize all this erudition into the riveting sentences, paragraphs, chapters, and books on a bright and colorful screen that shows no signs of fading. Google Earth is a feeble metaphor for work of such elegance, of course, and we would do better to stick with Peter Brown's own metaphors if we want to appreciate the imaginative and heuristic work they play in his work. How many of you yesterday got goosebumps when you heard these sentences, which moved from bibliographical technicality to sublime metaphor in the space of a few dozen words? To devote exclusive attention to the structural problems within the Christian community that accompanied the rise of unitary episcopate and a professionalized clergy is misleading. It is not so much to miss the wood for the trees, it is to miss the sap in the trees themselves. We all desperately want to plagiarize that conceit in our own next public lecture. And one of the reasons it's so powerful is that it takes a cliche, not seeing the forest for the trees, and reverses the metaphor brilliantly to find the inner life in an apparent vehicle of blindness and death. Another moment in yesterday's lecture took us from Domitian to A Midsummer Night's Dream in the blink of an eye, as Peter Brown traced a subtle genealogy of hard-handed men from Roman Palestine to Shakespeare's Athens. Peter Brown writes hard-handed but never heavy-handed prose. This is writing that shows us its calluses on occasion, yet gently ushers a world beyond recognition into a new kind of familiarity. I began my introduction with the opening sentences of Peter Brown's first book, published the year I was born. I'll close with the final sentences of not his last but his latest book, published earlier this year. They come from the end of Through the Eye of a Needle, his magisterial book on wealth, the fall of Rome, and early Christianity. This book has sought to bring readers back to those centuries, roughly between the years 350 and 550 AD. To do this has meant entering a very ancient world in order to encounter a very ancient Christianity. It was in this world that the conglomerate of ideas that medieval persons took for granted was first formed. As we have seen, these ideas emerged slowly, in a hesitant and conflict-laden manner very different from the way that they would later come to circulate in the triumphant Catholicism of the Latin West and in the various Christianities of more modern times. If this book has helped readers make the journey back to a world before our world, a world from which so many of our own views on wealth and poverty have derived, I will be content. Contentment cuts both ways, of course, and our own will be greatly enriched over the next hour as Peter Brown delivers the second of his lectures, In the Likeness of the Angels, Alms and Labor in 3rd and 4th century Syria. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Peter Brown.